At my grandfather's funeral, the world felt strangely still, as though the clouds themselves had lowered in grief. The lilies lining the chapel gave off a sweet, suffocating perfume, clinging to the air like a reminder that death had arrived, and it wasn't leaving until it had taken everything. Grief pressed down on my chest, thick and unbearable, but my father stood tall, too tall, as though pride were holding up his spine. Then, with the coldest calm, he said the words that turned my blood to ice. "We'll take everything. You're getting nothing." My siblings actually cheered. Their laughter cracked through the silence like breaking glass, sharper than the sound of the coffin lid closing. Landon's smug grin was wide enough to slice through my patience, and Sienna's cruel little giggle echoed off the marble walls. I didn't flinch. I didn't let them see me bleed. Instead, I smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of my lips, and leaned forward. "Dad," I said softly, almost gently, "which law firm is handling the estate?" He lifted his chin, pride radiating off him like heat. "Carter and Associates," he said. "They're in charge." My pulse slowed, my breathing steadied. That was the moment everything shifted. I let the silence stretch just long enough for every smug face in that room to lock their eyes on me. Then, I laughed, not loud, just enough to make their confidence falter. "Dad," I said, my voice smooth as glass, "I own Carter and..." The silence that followed. I swear even the walls stopped breathing. Landon's smirk collapsed, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. Sienna's phone slipped in her hands, clattering against the pew before she scrambled for it like a lifeline. Bennett, the family CFO, went pale as parchment. My mother's wine glass trembled so hard that the crimson spilled onto the chapel floor, like a final offering for Walter. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I stood taller and explained, calmly, that Carter and Associates had already appointed an independent partner to manage the estate, because protocol demanded it. I wasn't there to take revenge. I was there to protect Walter's legacy, something no one else in that room had the heart to do. The attorney confirmed it. Everything was legal, proper, untouchable. And that's when fate intervened. The doors creaked open, and an attendant stepped forward, rain still dripping from his coat. In his hands was a sealed envelope, marked with a deep red wax stamp, the letter W, my grandfather's seal. It was addressed to me. My chest tightened. Somehow he had known. Maybe he had always known. I tucked the letter inside my jacket, my heart pounding as though Walter himself had placed his hand on my shoulder from beyond the grave. The formal session to divide the estate would happen later, but in that moment, every single person in that chapel knew the balance of power had shifted. And this was only the beginning. So stay with me. What happens next will explain everything. Why my grandfather trusted me more than anyone else, and why this single letter might burn my family's empire to the ground. 72 hours, I said evenly, my tone calm as a blade laid flat. That's how this works. Richard's jaw ticked, muscles tight enough to crack. His voice dropped low, every syllable dragging like gravel. "No, we talk tonight. Bellevue, 8 o'clock. I nodded once, my smile never faltering. He thought he had cornered me. He had no idea I'd been preparing for this moment my entire life. For years I had been the forgotten son, the outcast, the one they never expected to stand tall. But that morning, I wasn't just standing tall. I was holding the match, and everything they'd built was kindling. The chapel doors swung open behind me as I stepped out into the misty rain. Walter's letter was warm against my chest, as if it carried a heartbeat of its own. The sky above Seattle wept hard enough to blur the world into streaks of gray. Memories came at me like shrapnel, sharp, sudden, impossible to stop. To understand why I smiled that morning, you'd have to understand why I ever left this city. I was 12 when I taught myself to code on a dusty old desktop. Walter had given me one Christmas. By 15, I'd built my first clumsy little app. It crashed more than it worked, but it was mine, proof that I could create something from nothing. When I graduated top of my class from the University of Washington, double major in computer science and business, I thought, finally, I had earned my father's respect. I still remember the day I stood before the Callahan Tech boardroom, a 22-year-old kid with shaking hands but a heart full of hope, pitching a plan to integrate cloud-based solutions. I didn't even make it halfway through my presentation before Richard cut me off, waving his hand like I was some overeager intern. Impractical, naive, he said, dismissing me in front of the entire board. Landon laughed. The board members avoided my eyes, the silence worse than any insult. That humiliation didn't just hurt. It branded me, carved deep into my identity, like a scar I would never lose. So I left Seattle with nothing but $5,000, a backpack, and a promise to myself I would never need their approval again. San Francisco was brutal. I lived in a room split my days between grinding as a junior legal consultant and spending my nights hunched over code, my fingers bleeding against the keyboard. Slowly, line by line, deal by deal, I built Carter and Associates from the ground up. The name on the firm wasn't mine. I hid behind J. Carter, a shell to protect myself from the Callahan name that had always been a curse. I built firewalls, both digital and moral, internal audits, independent partners, systems so locked that even I couldn't interfere. If my name was going to mean something, it had to stand on integrity. At first, my clients were small family businesses, broken by the kind of estate disputes I had grown up watching. I built a platform that turned chaos into clarity. Soon, mid-size corporations came knocking. The company grew. 8 years later, Carter and Associates was worth over $200 million. But the money wasn't the point. The point was to prove, to myself, to my father, to anyone who had ever laughed at me, that I was not the failure they made me out to be. And then I met Angela Rhee. Angela was a corporate attorney with a sharper tongue than anyone I'd ever known. She saw through me instantly, cut through my ambition like it was paper. She reminded me there was a line between justice and revenge, and she never let me forget it. When you go back, she said one night over whiskey, make sure you're there to heal, not burn it all down, otherwise you'll just become him. For years I stayed away. Then came the night Walter walked into my office unannounced. He looked smaller, slower, but his eyes still had that fire, the same fire that built Callahan Tech from nothing. He handed me a check for $250,000. This isn't charity, he said, his voice firm. This is a test. Prove to me you can stand on your own, and if the day comes when this family drowns in its own lies, you'll be ready. Then he handed me a copy of a handwritten addendum from the earliest days of Callahan Tech, a clause that said the future heir must prove their worth through action, not entitlement. I kept that paper locked in my office safe, a quiet reminder of what I was building toward. When the call came, Walter's gone. I stood at my office window, staring out at the fog curling over the San Francisco Bay. The city that had hardened me felt suddenly small. The time had come. Book me a flight, I said. I'm going home. 6 months before the funeral, I began preparing. I stood before a dry erase wall covered in names, dates and connections, board members, shareholders, family allies, family enemies. To anyone else, it was chaos. To me, it was a battlefield map. And by the time I landed in Seattle, I wasn't just Jet Maverick, the forgotten son. I was Jay Carter, the man who held the keys to everything Richard thought he controlled, and Bellevue was where the first domino would fall. 6 months before the funeral, my San Francisco office walls were no longer whiteboards. They were war rooms. Names, shell companies, LLC filings, vendor agreements, every artery that fed the Callahan family empire. We mapped everything. Vendors, charitable entities, tied to the Callahan Family Trust, half-forgotten marketing firms that existed more on paper than in practice, a freight company with a grand name and no trucks, and a boutique creative agency that boasted 3 clients yet paid rent like it had 30. Black ink for family-owned assets, blue for outside vendors, green for pass-throughs. Thin lines of connection ran between them until the wall looked like a conspiracy board. But it wasn't paranoia, it was simply accounting with the lights on. We started small, quietly, through a Delaware holding company I controlled. We bought minority stakes, 1% here, 3% there, just enough to earn contractual monthly statements, vendor-level ledgers, receivable aging reports, and those footnotes executives pray no one ever bothers to read. Our counsel drafted covenants that demanded timeliness and truthfulness. Our auditors verified every data source, every number, every dollar, every transaction was logged, tracked, dissected, and then the pattern emerged. It wasn't a number at first, it was a rhythm. Toward the end of each quarter, one particular marketing agency's billing spiked every single time. Regardless of whether a major campaign was running, the description lines grew thinner, almost lazy. Brand spend activation, influencer outreach, premium creative retainer. Not illegal, just convenient. We cross-referenced that agency's cash flow against its largest client, Callahan Tech. Then we followed the trail of money as it left the agency and landed almost every time within 3 days at a boutique creative studio incorporated by one of Landon's college friends. From there, the funds bled into luxury, leased cars, resort deposits, last-minute photography teams, an event series that plastered Sienna across social media as the glossy, curated face of a tech-forward lifestyle. $300,000 in 2 quarters. Disguised as brand spend, the explanations we received were elastic, stretched until they were almost translucent. 2 months before the funeral, I flew to Seattle under my own name and asked Bennett, our CFO, for coffee at his favorite glass-walled cafe, the one he liked because the espresso made him feel European. He didn't recognize me at first, or maybe he pretended not to. We made polite conversation about market headwinds, M&A chatter, the price of talent in a bad hiring cycle. But the moment I asked about the marketing accruals, his hand stilled on the rim of his cup, like it was a trigger guard. "Those numbers will normalize next quarter," he said smoothly. "Front-loaded spend on brand, that's all it is." I pressed. "Specifics?" He just smiled at the window, watching the drizzle streak the glass. "Sometimes," he said softly, "you let a quarter breathe. We'll clean it up." The bill came. He insisted on paying with the company card. I didn't confront him then. Confrontation was too easy. I preferred evidence. The next morning, my team issued lawful document requests to every vendor in which we held equity. We pulled subledgers, bank verifications, email, and we found it. Not fraud, not quite, but something more telling. Journal entries looping funds in a perfect circle. Expense booked at Callahan Tech, revenue at the agency, service fees out to the studio, back to Callahan Tech as content strategy with no deliverables. The email that sealed it landed 3 days later from the COO of the agency, caught through discovery. "Keep quiet till we're past this quarter," signed with Bennett's initials. It wasn't a confession to a crime. It was worse. It was a confession to a culture. 12 days before the funeral, we found something older. Something far more dangerous than any memo. Buried under years of filings, hidden inside a filing cabinet no one had touched since the Reagan administration, we discovered Callahan Research 1978, LLC, a dormant subsidiary created the year Walter filed his first patent. On paper it looked harmless, a shell holding nothing but legacy IP documents. But inside its archived minutes, in my hands, was the real secret. And that secret would burn everything. Grandfather's careful hand had left more than just memories. It had left instructions, hidden in the folds of his old letters, in the precise loops and strokes of his pen, were references to a protective provision, a golden right tied directly to the company's foundational technology. It wasn't a poison pill in the modern sense. No, it was something subtler, stronger, a moral circuit breaker. Certain decisions, including the disposition of core intellectual property, required the approval of a single holder, one person, designated by Walter himself, updated. I traced the pen strokes with my eyes, memorized every curve, every slash, every pause between words. I didn't yet know how that right would resurface, or whether Richard had managed to sidestep it, but I could feel Walter's fingerprints at the edges of everything I was uncovering, as if he had been laying breadcrumbs for a version of me he hoped would exist. 48 hours after the funeral, the Callahan house was eerily quiet. Rain tapped against the windows like a metronome marking time we weren't meant to waste. Then Richard's message arrived. Family meeting at Bellevue early evening. I arrived with an independent partner from Carter and Associates, our firewall against conflict, and the sealed letter tucked in my jacket. Outside the gates, my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. A low, hurried voice whispered, "Don't open Walter's letter in front of him." Then the line went dead. I circled the block once more, parked beneath the cedar trees, and slid the envelope into a lockbox bolted inside the glove compartment. My thumb brushed the wax W one time before the click of the key sealed it shut. Whatever Walter wanted me to read, he wanted it on my terms. 72 hours after the funeral, we filed the notices for a formal session regarding the estate. But Seattle families don't live by rules, they live by rhythms. Before the formalities, there was a ritual dinner. By the time I reached the front steps, rain had slowed to a steady patter. Through the glass, Eleanor sat in the dining room, her shoulders squared, a small miracle. Bennett's coat hung by the door, dripping onto the polished hardwood. I rested my hand on the brass handle, inhaled deeply, and reminded myself why I had returned. Not to ignite flames, no matter how dry the timber, not to impose vengeance. I was here to let the truth speak. Inside, Walter's eyes seemed to watch from every portrait, calm, relentless, like he did when tending a plant under construction. I whispered under my breath, "I'm here to no one," then stepped into the light. Richard loved ceremony. The dining room was staged like a magazine photograph. A walnut table stretched long enough to host a small parliament. Crystal glasses were arranged like a code, each reflecting the chandelier's honey-colored light. At the head, a portrait of Walter faced forward as if to say, "I am still here." Outside, rain stitched static across the windows. Inside, the chandelier made everything look warmer than it felt. Richard stood, a glass of Bordeaux held high enough to command attention. "To tradition," he said, voice heavy with practiced gravitas. "To Walter, to the Callahan name enduring." He didn't look at me. Landon, 2 seats down, smirked like a man who'd never written a check without someone else watching. Sienna hovered in the balance between performance and discomfort. Phone down for once. Eleanor set her glass on the tablecloth with care, trembling but composed. I let him finish. Then I asked the question I knew he planned to skate past. Who actually controls the foundation? The trustees of record, or a subcommittee you appoint? Bennett shifted in his chair, just enough to glance at Richard, a subtle gesture, the movement of a man who knows when to follow. "The foundation is a vehicle for legacy," Richard said smoothly, adjusting his tie with the hand that wasn't holding his glass. "It allows us to keep the company whole, less fragmentation, less weakness." "Whole is one thing," I said, my voice measured. "Opaque is another." I slid a folder 2 inches across the tablecloth. Inside, invoices, transfers, supporting attachments. Richard's smile thinned. "You don't get to grill us in our own home," he said. "I'm not grilling you," I replied evenly. "I'm giving you a chance to tell the truth before the paper does." His glass hovered. "What paper?" "The one showing roughly $300,000 leaving Callahan Tech as brand spend, hitting a friendly agency, then moving to a creative studio run by your son's friend. From there, days that somehow always featured Sienna." Landon barked a laugh, far too loud in the carefully staged room. "You have no idea how advertising works," he said. Sienna's eyes stayed on her glass, quiet, vulnerable. "You told me you'd clean those up," she whispered, just enough for all of us to hear. "Entries would be gone by quarter end." The room's temperature shifted. Landon's face hardened. "Why would you say that?" He spat at her. I opened the folder. The summary sheets were clean, deliberate, courtroom style. "We could walk through this line by line," I said. "Or we can agree that these pass-throughs happened, and talk about fixing the system that allowed them." Richard's finger jabbed toward me, a futile gesture. You walked into a funeral and tried to steal a company. I walked into a funeral and told you the truth, I replied, voice calm, unwavering. And I haven't even opened the one letter in this house that could burn you to the ground, because I still believe there's a right way to do this. Bennett leaned forward. There are explanations, timing issues. Sometimes we advance spend to lock pricing. Then the creative studio should have deliverables, I countered. Dates, briefs, proofs. Instead, you have a circle of invoices and an email that says, keep quiet till we're past this quarter. Bennett looked at the chandelier instead of me. Those words were poorly chosen, he muttered. Eleanor reached for her glass and missed. Bordeaux tipped, a bright red arc across the white cloth, blooming like something alive. Everyone watched it spread to the edge of a plate, a heart deciding to keep beating in the middle of a room built on appearances. Richard broke first. We are not doing this at my table, he said, iron in his voice, though it trembled in the middle. Jed, I said, my voice calm but firm, in my office, now. I closed the folder. Bring Bennett, I added. He signed the entries. He should be in the room. Landon pushed back, hands slamming the polished wood. This is harassment. No, I said, standing, letting my height fill the space. This is accountability, and we're still doing it privately. You should thank me for that. Sienna's phone buzzed against the table. She didn't flip it over. For the first time that night, she looked at me. Something like apology lingered in the set of her mouth. I nodded once. Later, if later existed, we could repair this. Richard gestured toward the hallway, impatient, then paused to look back at Eleanor. She gave the smallest nod, quiet but resolute, signaling more than I had expected. I followed him down the corridor lined with photographs. Walter breaking ground on a facility. Richard shaking hands in a borrowed tuxedo. The three of us as children, elbows and knees in the sun. The rug muted our steps. In my pocket, the absence of Walter's unopened letter felt heavier than the letter itself. At the door to his office, Richard leaned close, voice low. You think you've won because you own a firm and a few % of some vendors. You don't understand this family. I understand exactly what this family is, I said, meeting his gaze. I'm asking if you want it to be something better. He opened the door, waved me in. Bennett stood by the window, reflection hovering over the black lawn. On the wall, next to the first patent, hung a photograph of Walter, pen in hand, eyes steady, looking like he had built a life out of nothing. Behind us, the dining room had gone silent. The red stain still crept across the tablecloth, longer than the spilled wine had ceased. The door clicked softly, a sound louder than a slam. Richard circled his desk like a man reclaiming a throne, palm smoothing polished wood, gaze fixed on me as if I were trespassing. Bennett lingered near the window, hands in pockets, eyes on the rain. The room smelled of leather and old victories. Walter's first patent loomed above a scale model of headquarters, yellow grandfather's funeral. You've always wanted to cut me down, and now you found your angle. I wanted the truth in the room, I said, laying the folder on the desk and opening it to the summary page. Is this the leadership you defend? Pass-throughs marked brand spend, routed to an agency, then to a studio run by Landon's friend, buying perks, vanity campaigns. That's not legacy, it's leakage. There are reasons, Richard said too fast. We invest in image. That's business. Then show the work, I said. Creative briefs, deliverables, outcomes. Because what I have are journal entries, looping funds, and an email that says, keep quiet till we're past this quarter, signed with Bennett's initials. Bennett finally turned, uncomfortable. The phrasing careless, he said. The money wasn't careless, I countered. Richard's jaw flexed. You don't dictate terms in my house. This isn't about your house, I said. It's about the company Walter built, about the people whose mortgages depend on it, about the rules I live by, even when they make my life harder. I brought an independent partner tonight. I haven't filed anything. I came to offer a path to fix the system, and protect the name we claim to love. You're not family when it suits you, he shot back. You hide behind a firm and pretend you're better than blood. I slid a single page across the desk. Bennett co-signed the pass-throughs. That moves this beyond family. It's governance, and it's on you because you knew enough to look away. Richard stared at the signature line. The color drained from his face. He steadied his hand on the model headquarters, as if it might tip over. I protected my son, he said, voice rasping through gravel. That doesn't make me a monster. That makes me a father. It also makes you a steward who failed your duty, I said. The word you came out like a verdict. You, he whispered, and it landed in the room like a hammer. You are the one who abandoned us. San Francisco, the secrecy, the arrogance. I reached into my jacket and placed Walter's sealed letter on the desk, without breaking the wax. The red W caught the lamp's glow, throwing a small fire of reflection across the polished wood. His lawyer touched his arm. He yanked it away. I changed the slide. New heading, accountability and remediation. The system is broken, I said, voice steady, eyes sweeping the room. Not because of technology or policy, but because of choices. Every quarter-end loop, every invoice routed through shadows, every shortcut you thought invisible. It's here, all of it. Richard's hands clenched the edge of the table. Landon leaned back, smirk faltering. Sienna swallowed, elbows digging into her side. The independent partner gave a barely perceptible nod, signaling this was the moment governance overtook ego. I clicked the next slide. Flowcharts of transactions blinked on the wall, highlighting every detour the funds had taken. $300,000, quarter after quarter, routed through friendly agencies and side studios. I said, no deliverables, no accountability, only appearances, and yet each time approvals were rubber-stamped. All of you had visibility, or should have. A director at the far end cleared her throat. We received an email last week, she said, lifting a printed page, from Bennett to the marketing agency. Prepare to unwind positions. The old man won't hold for long. Can anyone explain this? Bennett worked his jaw, like the memory had just surfaced. That was a contingency note, he said finally. Markets move, I countered. You were protecting the company. I was protecting a practice, and your own exposure. Nothing more. Landon's chair legs scraped the polished floor. This is a circus, he spat. You think you're a hero because you found a few payments. I had debts, personal. I handled them. No customer got hurt. There it is, I said softly. He realized he'd admitted it. I switched the slide again. The title glowed in bold. Remediation path. The ledger isn't just numbers, I said. It's a map. Every detour, every gap, every silent approval, visible. We are going to clean this, independently, fully, every sub-ledger verified, every journal entry reconciled, every vendor accountable, nothing hidden, nothing ignored. Carter and Associates will oversee compliance, and you, everyone in this room, will certify it, or face exposure. The choice is yours. Richard's jaw flexed. He opened his mouth, closed it again. He could no longer rely on authority, or fear, or tradition. The room was quiet, taut with tension, like a wire stretched across an abyss. I looked at Bennett. You countersigned. Own it. Lead the effort, or be removed. I turned to the rest. And for the record, Walter's letter is law, history and moral compass all in one. No one touches it but me. It doesn't authorize vengeance. It authorizes truth. You either bring everything into the light, or the shadows will expose you. The room held its breath. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight cut through the slate-gray clouds and reflected on the glass, a harsh reminder that transparency cannot be avoided. Finally, I leaned back, hands resting on the polished table. Let's get to work. The room remained silent, but in that silence, the weight of inevitability settled. Family pride, ego, and old authority. They all had to bend to law, accountability, and truth. And as I glanced at the projector, at the lines tracing every pass-through, every diversion, I felt the first real warmth of vindication. Not for wealth, not for revenge, but for the idea that legacy should mean something more than power or appearances. There was one final matter. I handed the first binder to the chair of the audit committee. Callahan Research 1978 LLC. It contained a class of interest Walter had described as a protective provision, guarding the company's foundational technology. Certain transfers, certain encumbrances, required the approval of the holder of that interest. Richard scoffed. That entity is archival. A dead file, he said. It's quiet, I replied. Not dead. Not dead. It had been updated the year I left Seattle. Walter's amendment explicitly designated the holder of that protective interest, the person he trusted most to defend the company's core technology from misuse. Filed with counsel, notarized, and recorded in the entity's minutes. I placed a certified copy on the table. The notary seal caught the lights like a quiet warning, and there it was, he had named me. Silence fell, heavy and unyielding. A director near the middle finally spoke. If that's accurate, he said carefully, then certain actions Richard contemplated, transferring assets to the foundation without proper oversight, would have required the holder's approval. That is correct, I said. They did not have it. Richard's knuckles whitened against the chair back. You will not take this company from me with paperwork and posturing, he growled. Paperwork is how you built it, I said calmly, and it's how we ensure it doesn't become a personal bank. This isn't punishment, it's repair. The chair of the board called a brief recess, consulting with counsel, and returned with language that had been gathering dust for decades, the kind of clause you hope never needs activation. A motion was placed on the table, a vote of no confidence in Richard as CEO pending a thorough review of the control environment, vendor relationships, and the appointment of interim leadership compliant with the protective provision. The votes weren't dramatic. They were deliberate. Hands rose. Names were recorded. The motion carried. The chair turned to me. Given the documentation and your role, she said, we ask that you serve as interim CEO while the review proceeds, maintaining independent oversight over both the estate process and the with full scope and controls so robust, this conversation will never need to happen again. Agreed, she said. Richard shoved his chair back. It rattled the wall, and a framed photograph, anchored more securely than he realized, held fast. He pointed at me, voice lower than it had been in the dining room. You've dragged your family into the fire, he said. If it burns, it will burn you too. I gathered the letter and binders. Or, I said, we finally learned to live in the light. As the room rose, movement replacing the quiet of decision, I caught my reflection in the glass. A man I recognized, not because of a last name, but because of the work he had chosen. The sky outside had not brightened, but the room did. Walter's words lay warm in my palm, older than fear, steadier than my father's anger. I slid the letter back into its envelope and walked toward the door, not a son asking to be seen, but a steward ready to answer for what he held. That night, the fire in Bellevue's living room burned brighter than the lamps. Shadows stretched across family portraits, Walter's gaze pressing on us all. Richard accused me of corrupting the board, of plotting against him for years. I answered with facts, the diverted funds, the protective clause from 1978, Walter's letter affirming leadership through action, not entitlement. When I placed the contract copy on the table, Richard fell silent, eyes caught by his father's handwriting. Landon tried to lunge at me, but Sienna stepped between us. For the first time she defended me. At least he built something real, she said. The words froze him more effectively than any hand. Then it finally confessed that Richard had pressured him into signing off, though he admitted he retained duplicates of every file, evidence that could destroy everything if exposed. The weight of that truth darkened the room. Then my mother, long silent, spoke clearly. She warned Richard that if he continued to hide, she would stand beside me in public. The fire cracked in response, and Richard's shoulders dropped. You've won, he said, voice breaking, but let's see if you can hold this family together. It wasn't surrender, not fully, but it was the closest he had ever come. 6 months later, Seattle gleamed under a new name, Callahan Carter Technologies. I stood on stage unveiling our platform, applause rising as the logo lit the hall. Richard sat in the front row as honorary advisor, older, quieter, and when cameras turned he shook my hand before the world. Landon had left for business school. His first letter to me was one of gratitude. Sienna now worked as a brand ambassador, her presence serious and deliberate. My mother spoke proudly of her education projects, her glass of wine replaced by a stack of pamphlets. After the launch, I paused by Walter's portrait hanging between the new exhibits, whispered, "I did it, Grandpa." That evening we gathered again in Bellevue. The table felt different, not perfectly healed, but no longer poisoned. Later, on the balcony overlooking the city lights, I realized I was no longer the son left behind. Success wasn't revenge, it was about building something stronger, protecting truth, so it could survive. And for the first time, the future felt like ours to share.